Hey, good morning, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. It is Thursday, April 17th, 2025 at 11:03 in the morning. And so now we're switching gears. We're at our yearly check-in with Department of Labor to better understand where the unemployment trust fund sits. That's a requirement that we put in, I think, in 2010 or 11 when we came to an agreement on how to fix the trust fund. And so I think it's even more relevant given what's going on with things in Washington on the possibility of going into recession. So I think we want to know where the trust fund sits and how strong it is to make sure that we have what's adequate to protect Vermonters. So we have Matt Barowitz with us from the Department of Labor. Matt, good morning. Good to see you again. We haven't seen much of you this session, but I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yes, good morning. My name is Matthew Barowitz. I am the Director of the Economic and Labor Market Information Division at the Vermont Department of Labor. Thank you so much for having me. Certainly have missed our conversations, but it seems like you have been busy doing other things. Unemployment insurance and the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund is a little bit of a technical, a little bit of a complex specialization. So I welcome questions throughout. We can start with questions, or if you want me to just kind of give an overview of where we're at.
I think that would be good.
I did provide the Vermont Department of Labor supplied the copy of the recent report, which was filed the beginning of this year. But I also thought, because it is we're already into April, that we could take a look at how the fund is doing based on the most recent data. This is a big part of the year. And so I think I actually kind of want to start with the slide deck, if that's okay. Because I think it kind of brings the story in a little warmer than, a legislative report, which can be a lot of language. So I like pictures. Pictures mean stories. Story means I get to fill in the words and handle questions as they come up. Oh, thank you. Little housekeeping, not super necessary, but my division, there's a division like mine in every state in the nation, plus Guam, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and DC. We form the 54 territory state U.S. Department of Labor's data systems. So we're all collecting data, compiling data, consistent with federal methodology and releasing that information. The unemployment rate, how many jobs in manufacturing, those are all roles and responsibilities we have within my team, funded by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But it's the Employment and Training Administration that gives us dollars to study the trust fund, to do presentations, to be here today, have websites, special studies. So we always welcome ideas and thoughts about special studies. So who doesn't love a good graph in the morning before lunch? Weekly total regular unemployment insurance claims. So what we have here is 5 years of data. You'll notice 2020 and 2021 are not on this chart. If we put them on this chart, it would throw everything off. So let's just kind of put 2020 and 2021 aside. If you want to take a deep dive into how atrocious the unemployment situation was during COVID and the subsequent recession afterwards, that's a separate conversation. And we're hoping, let's all knock on wood, that is in the past, and that type of recession as it relates to a pandemic-driven recession is in the past, so we can more talk about things I'm more trained to talk about: business cycles, economic expansion, economic contractions associated with other things like supply and demand, as opposed to pandemics. So we have 1 year here, 2019, that is before the pandemic, and you'll see that's actually the top line. What you have from left to right is number of weeks in the year, 52 weeks in the year. And then up to down is the thousands of claims that we get for unemployment insurance on a week-to-week basis. We track this information weekly. We release that information on Thursdays. And so this is the most recent information we have. You see, these are all historic lows. 2019 was a historic low, and we were kind of at a point back then when we were talking about the trust fund. The trust fund was at, I think, $500 million. We had record low levels of unemployment. We were all kind of scratching our head at the end of that session. Well, what's going to happen? We don't know. But then obviously our hand was forced with the COVID pandemic. surprisingly, 2 years after that, look how fast things reestablish themselves back to that traditional seasonal pattern we see in Vermont. We have a very consistent pattern of when people file benefits, what industries are filing benefits, our seasonal patterns of construction typically, wraps up their session or their season around October into November, depending on how fast winter comes on. The mountains ramp up their activities around that time, and there's an inverse thing in the summer. But you'll see that how clearly this pattern is, especially in the last 4 years here, 2022 to current, how tightly the week-to-week claims has been. So it's been very consistent, and these are, as I said, record low levels of unemployment insurance claims. We are right now just finishing up our busy season as it relates to claims activities. So currently we have a little under 4,000 unemployment insurance claims that we're handling on a week-to-week basis. But prior to this, it was not uncommon to have 5, 6, 7,000 during the busy season.
Is this a calendar year or is this the state fiscal year?
This is a calendar year. Yeah. So we're starting January basically to December. And you see how they kind of mirror at the end where your high seasons go in. And there'll be those spikes that every now and then you'll see a little spike in there, and it's the same spike. You'll see either 1 week up or 1 week back. That could be a school layoff, could be like post-secondary is on vacation this month, these 2 weeks. They shut down operations. There's employees that are eligible for unemployment insurance benefits that would come in through the system. It's very predictable that we would see these things happen. Think support staff at like post-secondary education, bus drivers, cafeteria workers.
Only if they're employed by a third party, correct?
Yes. Well, yeah, I think so. Because the university probably, or the schools don't do that directly at the post-secondary level. So yeah, so there is a lot of consistency, and there's always these little spikes and things, ups and downs. For note, if you want to see just like a historical reference, the green line being 2023, that was one of the big deviations in the last 4 years we've seen, is the summer, and that was the flooding of 2023. And so you can see what happened as it relates to unemployment insurance claims. It popped up to 2019 levels, but again, those were considered low at the time. And within a period of 2 to 3 months, it was back down to where the trend has been for 2022, 2024. You will notice 2025 is a little bit warmer as it relates, not in terms of heat, but in terms of claims. Our claims levels are up a little bit than where we were in 2024, but nothing shocking or surprising as it relates to that. So you are seeing it's on the higher side. The 2025 is on the higher side of the cluster. So we are seeing elevated levels relative to last year, but when you take a step back and look at it compared to historical trends, we're still within those low bounds. I'll just take a quick pause there, see what we think.
How does that relate to the total employment picture? Could it be that total employment is up, therefore correspondingly the unemployment thing is peaking? That data?
I do have that data. Current levels of employment, we're at record levels of current employment. So there's the three major things. If you're looking for a top line summary, I just presented to the statewide workforce development board the other day. And so I had this stuff just ready to go. Our population was at an all-time high. We've never been at this level. We're around 648,000, plus or minus. There's a pretty big margin of error around that. But for argument's sake, considering margin of error, our population is the highest it's ever been. Our employment is the highest it's ever been. What is not the highest it's ever been is our labor force. And so that is a function of our demographics. So our labor force is still 5, 6, 7,000 off of peak labor force, which happened back in 2009 during that economic downturn. I can expand on that a little bit, why that happens. So that the recession started December 2007. That was a bad one. And statistically, it was actually worse than COVID because it wasn't as deep as the COVID recession, but it was longer. It was a very long, pronounced recession. And I can show some data on that later. But that 2009 corresponded with two things: the depth of that recession, and then the leading edge of the baby boomers coming into that retirement age. That was the leading edge of the baby boomers hit 65 in 2011. And some people were probably preparing to retire, even as 2008, 2009. But asset prices like housing and stock market prices were way down in 2009. And so if you were someone considering, hey, I'm getting about 6 months, a year out to retirement, you actually stayed in the labor force longer. So we had a pent up demand for retirements coming out of that recession, but also, as is customary during a recession, households, say, for example, you have a two-person household, one person has maybe economic insecurity around their job or cut hours. The second person might come into the labor force because of economic necessity, or people might leave education to go into the labor force. So during the depths of recession, you'll see your labor force grow because people need to make money. And we also had that added pressure of the leading edge of the baby boomers postponing retirements. And so that gave us a peak in 2009, about 5,000 to 6,000 over where we currently are. And then you see slow, gradual slope until you get to the COVID recession of the retirements. The leading edge of the baby boomers working through, by 2021, the leading edge of baby boomers was 75, and the labor force participation rate of people 75 and older is much, much lower than 65 and older. It really takes a big noticeable step down once you get to 75.
Thank you.
Yep. Other questions? Thank you for the computer. So let's talk trust fund. Let's talk dollars. Area of expertise in this room. 2022, we have what we have is the UI Trust Fund balance to pay benefits. The report has a longer look back on this, but we're focusing right now on 2023, or the last 3 years up to 2024. We just got finalized 2024 data. So that was not available when the report itself was written. And this is why I thought it'd be an interesting place to start, because you can see the trust fund growing. And that is a positive when you are in good economic times, which these are considered to be good economic times. We are not officially in a recession. We do not see surging levels of unemployment. You want your trust fund to grow, right? So that during bad times, when we're taking out more, that there is some reserves available. And so the growth over the last 3 years has been a positive one. We are currently, as of the end of the year, we're at 310 million. We're going to get a better snapshot in about 2 weeks of how the trust fund is doing, because of the nature of the trust fund as that, what we looked at in the first slide, a very cyclical nature. We are heavy drawers out of the trust fund between January and March. Then at the end of March, employers get a notice saying, hey, you owe us quarterly contributions. Those are due in 30 days. At the end of April, we will get our biggest infusion of cash into the trust fund. So the trust fund cash flow comes in the second quarter, technically. So we have a big drawdown in quarter one. Quarter two is a big cash infusion. And so we'll know at the end of the month, early May, how those collections prove to be.
My question was answered by me reading the slide, so we're in good shape.
Question we have to ask,
Yes.
but the taxable wage base is up too, right?
Yes. The taxable wage base is up, and I'm hoping I have it in the report. Yes. 8. My recollection, and I can double check that as well. We used to have a chart in here that had the taxable wage bases. Did not make it into the cut. We can supply that, the history.
More goes in and more comes out. Oh,
The taxable wage base. The taxable wage base is strictly related to the contribution side of the house. And so that's how much taxes are collected on the first dollars earned.
The taxable wage base goes up, more goes into the fund.
Yep.
And then
the wages are higher, so more gets paid out.
Right. There is that relationship of like how the taxable wage base is increased. There's also an increase to the benefits as well.
we didn't have that both sides, that's what got us into trouble. Taxable wage base was staying stagnant, but wages were going up, and plus, you have what's the factor what's the other piece to the contribution?
Oh, the tax rate schedule.
Yeah, your schedules. So those move up and down too. And
Why wasn't the tax base going up?
because nobody ever changed the taxable wage base, but we were giving more benefits. And benefits and plus the maximum weekly benefit was going up.
Because it was a set dollar,
And
it
we're
wasn't a
not-
percent.
And we're not moving,
Tricky.
and we weren't moving the taxable wage base.
I see.
And that got us into big trouble.
Yeah, that would. with the taxable wage, sorry, can I ask a question?
Mhm.
Taxable wage base, does it go up with inflation now, or does it go up as a percent? Or does it get set every year?
Yeah, it does get set every year and it's tied to the change in wages.
Oh, I see, okay, so it's just got it.
Yeah.
Change in wages and changes, where the fluctuation of the balance of the trust fund also, that all works together to make sure that we have sufficient money in there, but not so much that we're overtaxing it.
Right. Yeah, the trust fund, as the chair correctly pointed out, there's two mechanisms on the contribution side. There's 5 tax schedules, and the tax schedule from the one is the lowest, which is where we currently are at. So basically, when we do our annual calculation, it says, okay, you have ample reserves in your trust fund such that you can keep it at tax level 1. As the fund starts going down, you start moving into those higher tax brackets. So 1 through 5, you think about it as a matrix. The tax schedules 1 through 5, the 5th being the highest. And then within that, there is 21 different experience ratings for each code. So depending on how the employer leverages the fund, they can have a higher individual tax rate, even within the schedule, than some other ones that don't use the fund as much. So I took this job in 2010. My predecessor thankfully left enough breadcrumbs around, and actually it had many conversations in this state house saying, hey, we are in good economic times from the period of 2002 to 2007. But if you look at the direction of the trust fund, it's going down. These are the times you're supposed to be building up your trust fund, because when a recession happens, you need reserves available. So that my predecessor was saying, hey, putting everyone on notice. So the conversation was very well teed up for that, the big reform that occurred around that 2010 period. And it was necessary because even during good times, the trust fund was being whittled down. A recession did happen, that 2007 recession, and it was a doozy. The fund was exhausted, and we ended up borrowing $77.7 million from the federal government to pay benefits. And the challenge with that is twofold. One, when you're borrowing money from the federal government, employers lose what's called a FUTA tax credit. So they have to pay higher federal taxes. And that is an interest-bearing loan, and it cannot be paid by UI benefits. It has to be paid by the general fund or some other mechanism that the state funds it. But historically, I think it's been general fund. And, I think we all know the conversation around the general fund these days. I don't think anyone wants to be going to that conversation saying, hey, we owe a couple $1 million of interest for a loan we're taking out.
So some adjustments over time, it sounds like, in terms of the contribution rate. To what extent are those adjustments are those fixed in statute versus what kind of adjustments we've enabled the department to make yourself?
No, it is very set in statute. And so we have a calculation and an annual determination where we pull the information, do the calculations, and have it signed by the commissioner each year. And I can certainly provide copies of those if you want to see how the determination itself lines up to the statute. But it basically says, this is how it will be done. Just like the minimum wage, it says, this is how it will be done. You consult this data source, you do this, a lot of times with simple division, and you compare it against a chart to see how you rank. It's called a high benefit cost ratio is what it is you're trying to figure out what is the utilization of the fund on its worst day versus what's in the fund right now. So if you're thinking about, believe me, if this doesn't work, believe me, you won't be the first. This analogy is the one I use because it makes sense to me. If you think about your household budget, how much rainy day fund do you want in your bank account? Do you want 2 times your monthly bills? Do you want 3 times your monthly bills? And that's ultimately what this is saying. Here's your worst year. And if you have 2.5 times your worst year, all leveled out for value of time, dollars over time. But basically, if you have over 2.5 times your worst year, you can be at level 1, the lowest tax rate schedule. But if you have less than 2.5, you go lower down the tax rate schedule.
Oh, just a minute. And so to what extent is there any risk in terms of, so you have these factors that probably set out in statute.
Yes.
Wrong thing. But you probably have some factors that you use to make adjustments to the contribution rate. Is that the way it kind of works? No. Right in there.
Right in there.
Okay.
100%.
So I guess my question would be, what sort of risk is there in that sort of scheme, in terms of, you know, what some of the things we're thinking of now, you know, is it enough to be able to address, say, you know, the Great Recession or whatever the heck, you know, we might be facing now?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it does require legislative change or discussion if we're going to do something different. If you look at the most recent legislative change that happened to this, it was a small one, but it was significant. The Vermont Department of Labor, we looked at the trust fund. And as I said, it's take your worst day and base all these calculations based on your worst year, right? So we said, what if this whole COVID recession situation was a one-off? Do we really want to base all our calculations on a one-off situation where we had, 100,000 Vermonters working with the Vermont Department of Labor because of a global pandemic? And, through the legislative process, we actually got a waiver put in saying, what is the worst year you've had in the last 10 years? That wasn't 2020, right? And so now there is that carve out saying, we're not going to use 2020 as our base year because, kind of like my housing expenditure, like, oh, I bought a car last month. I'm not going to factor that into my rainy day fund as my baseline expenditure. We're going to say that was a one-off. And so currently in statute 2020 is we do all our calculations absent consideration of 2020 because of legislative change. And this is kind of where we got to, because otherwise, absent that legislative change, instead of being at Schedule 1, we would have been at Schedule 5. We would be taxing employers about 2 to 3 times higher than they currently are, and the fund would be growing at a rapid rate. And, to some that might sound attractive, to others that might, but it was a public policy discussion to say, you know what, we're coming out of a bad recession. We want to keep those dollars with employers to make sure that they have the resources they need to pay wages, to, keep their cash flow and their business afloat. As opposed to saying we want to stockpile the money in this fund for a rainy day.
I remember, but can't remember the period of time, but I think we were going to be over $1 billion in the trust fund if we had not done anything.
Yeah.
That means we were way overtaxing our business community.
Yeah.
So that is really helpful for understanding the cycle and the balance that Chairman just articulated. You made a comment that I'd like to just understand historically. You said that historically we go to the general fund with that $77.7 million borrowed by the federal government. How often does it happen?
I've been here 15 years. We borrowed once, and I'm not sure I don't know the long-term history of how many times we have borrowed. I could look into that to see. But when, during that time period, we did, I think it was a couple $1 million. Thankfully, because of the legislative reform, we paid off the loan much quicker than anticipated. And so that was the good news. So we only had to do it, I think, once or twice where we actually had needed to come up with an interest payment.
But the idea is that the cycles that we're seeing around, or that are a part of all the things you're describing, does not include occasionally needing to borrow from the federal government because we've zeroed out the trust fund. Okay.
Exactly.
That's good.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. And, to some people's point, again, like this is a public policy discussion for the people in this room. I am not a public policy expert. I'm here to provide information. There are certain states in this nation that they say if they have $1 in their trust fund, that's plenty, right? And the U.S. Department of Labor says, hey, you need to build up your trust fund. They're like, nah, we're good. And Vermont has always been like, no, we want to have at least a reserve, our rainy day fund. So to avoid that borrowing, other states have different, ways to pay back loans should they start borrowing, like a bond or whatever they might do, or just a general tax increase across the board. Every state has a different appetite for how they handle this. So, is the right amount $1 or $500 million? That's a public discussion, but there are risks if you go negative. And that's what the perspective of the Department of Labor is, just making sure people are aware. If you borrow, that interest has to be paid for somewhere else besides us. And employers will be hit harder with federal taxes as a result of borrowing.
Is borrowing from the federal government always the safety net, or is that a function of timing in the fiscal year? For example, are there other things that we can do if the trust fund is going negative? in its Budget Adjustment Act time, and there is a pool of money. Can that be shifted over, or is it automatically you have to borrow from the federal government?
That's a good question. My understanding is you can always contribute if you want, if you have extra dollars. Like, so during COVID, the COVID relief fund, some states just took some of their COVID money and just plowed it right in their unemployment insurance trust fund. Yep, yeah. So you can, thankfully, you know, because we are on a week-to-week basis and you can kind of see trajectories a lot of times, you kind of see things coming. And this is why, you know, I think this conversation becomes an interesting one, because one of the things we're noticing, if I could pivot to the next, so on its face, we look, okay, look, benefits are going up. And I had a conversation with the UI director about this to see, take their temperature, where they're at on this. You know, we look at this as a top line metric of how much benefits are available to pay, right? Or how much money is in the trust fund to pay benefits. So if we look at the major components, here is contributions coming in, the blue line, the red line being benefits going out. And you can see that this is a big contributor why the trust fund grows, right? So it's, you know, in 2022, you know, we were about $15 million to the plus. We were taking more in contributions. Again, during good economic times, you want to take more in contributions, pay out less in benefits, so that when the situation reverses, you have a pool of money to tap into. However, if you look at 2023, you start seeing the gap shrink. And then when you look at 2024, you see two things: that gap shrink even more. So benefits continuing to rise, contributions plateauing, and in fact decreasing in 2024. One of the ways I think, and this is an assumption, or a guess, we'll call it, one of the reasons I think the 2024 contributions went down is because of less job churn. So coming out of the COVID recession, there was a lot of talk about job changers. Oh, you know, people taking new jobs, trying new things. Well, that eventually returns back to normal. But every time you take a new job, for that employer, your taxable wage base is reset. And so it's not a big decline, but it is a noticeable decline, about $1 million between 23 and 24. So we're kind of at a, you know, a plateau of where we're at in terms of contributions, but you see the benefits amount rising.
But also, if your workforce, you have a shrinkage in your workforce, you can bring less money into the trust fund as well.
Yes. Yep. That would be another contributing factor. And we have seen some recent growth last year, notably in the labor force, still trying to catch up to where we were previously. And so it's this kind of conversation that I had with the UI team that put me on this, is saying, I think actually contributions and benefits are kind of keeping pace right now, so that this growth that we're seeing in the trust fund, if we look at the major components that are contributing to growth in the trust fund, there's three different categories on this. There is the difference between contributions and benefits, which is that gray line we just talked about. And you can see that gray line shrinking over those 3 years. There's interest. This is an interest-bearing account, so we do receive interest, which is great news. And you can see that the interest in 2022 is about $4 million. It goes to $6 million because the fund's getting bigger. It goes to $8 million. But interest is something you can only count on if you have money in the fund. And so if the fund gets depleted, that interest goes away as well. So that's not, you know, so we have to be conscious of how the fund is behaving, because it currently is having an adequate balance, that it's able to accrue $8 million in interest. And then one of the things that's hidden in this increase over the year is a one-time reimbursement. During COVID, part of the federal relief package, I don't remember what this one was called, said that the federal government will pay for the first week of everyone who gets unemployment. We just got that money in 2024. It was $15 million. So $15 million hit the trust fund. It was due to us. It was owed to us. That was money we paid out. We paid all those first weeks out ourselves. And it kind of became like, oh, all of a sudden, like, we're getting a check for $15 million. That is one-time money we're not going to get again. So when we look at this trust fund year over year increase, we have to kind of keep in mind of what's driving it. And the contribution and benefits portion of that is getting smaller and smaller. So we used to think, you know, in the last few years, I've been thinking, oh, the trust fund's growing about $15 million a year. I don't know if that's a safe assumption to assume anymore.
think that's where you're seeing that adjustment now where the taxable wage base is going up. I would bet that we're gonna see the schedules going up too, because we need to start replenishing that. And then everything is backwards, so we're looking a year back before adjustments happen. Representative Kimball?
Thank you, Chair Marcotte. Charlie Kimball from Windsor Ways and Means Committee. Matt, just one of the questions of possible slowing down of the contributions. I'm wondering if people's experience rating is now changing because it's after the layoffs because of, I know we had a forgiveness of experience rating, but is that another possible explanation that individual companies are contributing less because they have a better experience rating now?
We define experience rating.
Sure. Yeah, great question. For context, when we talk about the 5 rate schedules, which is 1 through 5, which is set based on where the health of the trust fund is. If you have a healthy trust fund, you're more paying the lower rate one, and then the 5th is the highest. It's a matrix that end up being, there's 21 rate classes. And so if you're a new company, you get put in at the 0. And then after that, there's 1 through 20. Those 1 through 20 are actually what's called, we're an array state, meaning your experience rate is calculated at the individual employer level, and it's calculated based on your utilization. So how much funds, it's a calculation of the last 3 years of benefits charged to your individual account divided by your taxable wage base for the last 3 years gives you a percentage. And then that number, your number, is ranked against the other 30,000 Vermont employers. Because we're an array state, everybody gets cut into equal buckets. It's based on wages, not in counts of employees or counts of employers. It's based on wages. So it shouldn't matter. So what happens is someone could even have they could have a lower experience rating, but they moved up because everyone else dropped lower than they did. So we've had that complaint before where an employer says, my situation improved. How come my tax rate went up? And it's because you improved, but you didn't improve as much as everyone else did. And so you got pushed down the array. And so it's meant to keep everything very balanced, but it can cause some, individuals to be quite frustrated with the system. Yeah.
Just remember in 2017, we were talking about experience ratings, and you inherit. So if you're a brand new company, as Matt said, you start at 0. But if you buy a company, you inherit their experience rating.
And there was an issue on that where people were looking to, there was something that was tweaking it in an unfair way.
A corporation was splitting off and moving their workers to the new company. So they're starting out at 0 instead of inheriting that.
And which would impact other businesses.
Everybody else has to make it up.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's the same with, seasonal companies as well. Everybody making it up. This is a whole fascinating.
This is
Little strings. Yeah.
Can I throw another string in the mix? How about all of this relate to household employers? For example, little context, we had disabled mother-in-law that we took care of in our house so that we didn't have to worry about and we chose to manage the care ourselves. So we were the employers, and it was pretty onerous to have to pay the unemployment insurance and still provide a good level of care. And if you will, keep her out of the system and keep her amongst her loved ones and all that. How do experience rates and things like that affect somebody who's clearly never done it before, so to speak, and yet here we are?
Yeah. And so we call it the 0 group. New employers are set a 1% unemployment insurance tax rate. So if you're a new employer, you're grouped in the 0 class, but you get a 1% until you are an employer for 3 years, where then you'd have an experience rating be able to be established to you. And then you'd be put into the array after 3 years. So if you are a new employer and you're technically the employer, you're filing those contributions, you would be calculated out. And in many cases, unless you reach 3 years of experience, you wouldn't even make it into the array. but it's quite possible you'd be at the lowest tax rate level if you hadn't laid anyone off. You'd just be grouped in just like everybody else.
Okay.
Yeah. But this is, I initially anticipated your question going a different way. I do want to reemphasize this is for an employee-employer relationship. This wouldn't include self-employed people. It wouldn't include people who work railroads. But this is, who is under the umbrella of unemployment insurance within the state of Vermont. Yeah. Other questions? Okay. Let's take a look. So I started to, this is that, I wanted to give that snapshot when we were talking about what do recessions look like? Here are 3 of them. So this is a graph left to right, 2001 to current. The blue blob is the axis on the right, and it is the number of unemployed people in the state of Vermont. Now, this is separate. There's 2 concepts here I kind of switched on you. I should have introduced. There's people who are unemployed. That's a Bureau of Labor Statistics or an economics definition of unemployed. You've looked for work in the last 4 weeks. I'm willing and able to accept work if offered. You're unemployed. Then there's what we were looking at on this screen, which is unemployment insurance benefits and people who are eligible to receive unemployment insurance benefits. That is a small subset of the people who are quote unquote unemployed. There's many people that, coming out of school or situations they maybe taken a break from the labor force and they're returning to the labor force, or you could be unemployed, but you're not eligible for unemployment insurance, or you're just not even part of the unemployment insurance system. So here we're talking about unemployed people who are receiving benefits. They're eligible for unemployment insurance benefits to the tune of, 3,000, 4,000 Vermonters. Here we're talking about unemployed statistical concept, how many people are employed, but this gives us a bigger picture of how the Vermont economy is doing. So we're talking about total level of unemployment right now is 9,000, 9,200. So we have 9,200 unemployed Vermonters. But the reason I put this up here is I wanted to show the last 3 recessions to show what happens during an economic downturn. So you can see the pink line is the unemployment rate, which is the left axis, and then the blue blob is the one I focus on because it's the number of people who are unemployed. And you can see the 2001 recession was the .com, and that one didn't hit Vermont very hard, right? We weren't overly reliant on tech companies at that time. So our unemployed population gets to about 15,000. Our unemployment rate gets over 4%. Those are high or elevated levels, but they were not significant recessions until you get to what we were talking about earlier, the Great Recession, a lot of people call it, that 2007 recession driven by a financial collapse. And you can see 6.7% unemployment rate, 24,000 unemployed Vermonters. I thought that was going to be the worst recession I'd ever seen in my time in terms of high points, because those are big numbers for Vermont. We typically have a lower unemployment rate than the country, and 24,000 unemployed Vermonters. At that time, and I use this as an illustrative example, we paid out $200 million in 1 year for benefits alone. $200 million. So it puts that, we currently have a fund of $310 million. And in 1 year of that Great Recession, we paid out $200 million. And that is $2,009, right? I haven't even done the math yet to figure, and I dared not before this. I didn't want to scare people too much, but if we bring those $2,009 into $2,025, is that $250 million? Is that $275 million? We're starting to talk about big numbers. Don't forget, that is just the benefits going out. Contributions are still coming in. And as soon as a year passed and we saw that the fund was going down, the contributions would be reset such that we would move out tax rate schedules, right? So the calculation is, the fund itself is meant to be quasi self-governing, not perfect to your point either. Sometimes you wish you had a little bit more human intervention, but it is a legislative process. It's legislatively dictated. And the fund itself would say, our fund's going down. We don't have the reserve ratios we'd like. We're going to move out tax rate schedules.
Problem back then was that although the schedules went up, taxable wage base stayed flat at 8,000, I think it was.
Right, 8,000.
And so even though we were collecting more tax, we still couldn't keep up, and we were hemorrhaging money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that there is a graph of that in the trust fund report itself, where the fund coming out of the 2001 recession was about 300 million, and coming into the 2007 recession, it was already down to 150. and during good economic times, half the fund had been eaten away just by the annual increases to the benefit amount. So that is I didn't know how deep you wanted to take it or how much conversation, but certainly kind of teeing it up for future discussions or additional questions. That at 310 million, we are in a good place, and that does put us at Schedule 1, the lowest tax rate possible. However, when we start looking at the contributions versus benefits, you're starting to see them converge, which is what the fund is supposed to do. It doesn't want to over collect. However, there is increased talk about recessions, and we're not sure about what that means. And not all recessions are created equal, because as you can see, these are three very different recessions. One that didn't hit Vermont very hard, one that hit us very hard, in fact, worse than about same as the US, but then the COVID one hit us harder than the US. That spiked to 50,000 unemployed people, but quickly returning back down relative to the 2007.
Just so everybody knows also that the trust fund is not our trust fund. The state has no control over that money. It's federal money. So the Department of Labor sends checks in. After they've collected from all the businesses, they send the money to the Fed, and the Fed is the one that puts interest into that. But if anybody has any strange ideas about, there's a place where we can grab some money, nope. That's not our money. Touch it.
Did you get interest on the $15 million one-time payment from the first week of unemployment?
I don't think so. I think it was just what was due and paid to us.
But now that it's in the fund.
Now it's in the
now
fund.
it's walking in.
Now it's collecting interest. Yeah.
You may have covered it and answered. I'm going to ask anyway. Can you go back to the contributions versus benefits page? Going up, and I'm just curious why.
Why the benefits are going up?
Yeah.
There's two, and I'm glad you brought this up, because there's actually two functions going on here. One, there is the annual rate of increase that is added to the benefit amount. So what happens is that each year we determine what the maximum weekly benefit amount is. And that maximum weekly benefit amount is increased by a certain percentage each year based on how wages and the economy are changing. So they kind of like keep up with inflation a little bit. But there was some legislative change, and the chair may remember this better than I do. There was a across the board $60 rider put right on top of it. So right now, instead of just being, okay, here's our maximum weekly benefit amount, which what is it? It's an awkward number. It's like 47% of the average wage. Something like that. 57%. Yes, thank you. So if the average wage is $1,000, then the maximum weekly benefit amount by statute would be $570. 57%. So that's a simple example. It's not an accurate example, but $1,000, 57% of that would be $570. But right now, because of legislation, there's an additional $60 put right on top of it, taking it to $630. And so there has been, I would say, a heightened pressure to bring up benefits. Certainly, I'm sure that's benefiting the claimants that are receiving it, but that does put downward pressure. And that was the intent. I mean, this was eyes wide open in that conversation of putting the $60 rider on top to increase benefit payments to those receiving.
The deal with his name.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it was part of the idea of saying we're not going to use the 2020 number to do the contributions calculation.
So the business community was getting a benefit, the labor community wanted a benefit.
Yeah.
So I think because of the software that we have, Department of Labor wasn't able to, what we wanted was across the board, $10 a week until we've extinguished, and I think it was 100 million.
Mm-hmm.
Just can't do it until the new system is up and running. So what we did was we said we could increase the maximum weekly benefit. And I think we had this small discussion last time, $60 up to 3 million, I think. 8 million.
Mm-hmm.
And so we haven't hit the 8 million mark yet, so that continues to go on the maximum weekly benefit. But again, it's only hitting the top wage earners, and I think our interest has always been we should be hitting our lower wage earners more than our higher wage earners. So once the new system is on board, then across the board, they'll be able to raise that by $10 for everybody. Really? Yeah.
I forgot all about that. Yeah, Matt, just, have you done any modeling at all to look at what a 3%, 4%, 5% increase in unemployment because of a recession would look like? The stress on the unemployment insurance trust fund?
Not recently. I would like to revisit that. What we saw the last time we looked at that, we modeled like an quote unquote average recession, like an average summer day in Vermont, right? Like those exist, right? Yeah. So an average recession, about 18 months, unemployment rate about 5% or so. And it exhausted the fund, but it did not deplete the fund such that we were borrowing, but it brought us way down. And what it did is because of the decrease, it kicked us from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 in this course of a year. And then the next year brought us from Schedule 3 to Schedule 5. And then it remained at Schedule 5 for 2 to 3 years until the fund was adequate to go down to 4, 3, 2, 1. And so there's normally that pretty consistent trajectory when we've modeled recessions. But we are overdue to model a new one.
That's wage base as well.
Yep. It would the taxable wage base grows right along with it on an annual increase. And I think currently as legislative rights, as you go down, the tax rate also has kind of like step functions down.
So it sounds to me that the adjustments that are in statute, the ability to adjust in statute are such that you don't sort of have a mid-year risk. In other words, you could have the trust fund could go down, but it doesn't sound like a risk that would occur, be really heightened during a calendar year. I'm trying to think about the ability of the legislature to take a look at something that really went bad. So it doesn't sound to me like it's a mid-year kind of risk. Is that correct?
Sort of, because there's two entry points, at least on the contribution side. If you're worried about how much money is coming into the fund, the taxable wage base is a calendar year. You could preemptively make a change to next year's calendar year taxable wage base. However, the tax rate schedule itself, whether we're at Schedule 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5, and this is a bigger lever to pull, which schedule you're on than just the taxable wage base, happens in July. So if there was going to be a legislative change, like for example, when we said ignore 2020 when doing your tax rate schedule calculation, that was able to take effect for that July's calculation. Yeah, so you can kind of impact it there.
All in all, the backstop to any disaster that happens is the Fed.
Yeah.
So people will still receive their unemployment.
Mm-hmm.
We may have to borrow if we ever get to that point. I think the COVID was an anomaly, a huge anomaly, because you're not going to see that many people lose their job in one swipe. Generally. That we were, I can't remember how many thousands of people, 80,000 people just on unemployment. We don't generally see that. And so your trust fund is still going to deplete, but you're still going to have people working. At that point, you didn't have that many people working, so we weren't replenishing the fund either. So there's a lot of different triggers, a lot of different things to consider, especially for Matt when he's modeling and trying to come up with scenarios that give us an idea of what we might expect.
And unfortunately, did not prepare this committee for a pandemic. In my 2019 report, it was absent consideration.
Yeah, I had a question kind of tearing off Herb's last question. And it's a process question so either one of you may feel like weighing in. We have the annual report which we're receiving now, are there any red flags or triggers or base levels that would cause you to bring an additional report to us and say, hey, here's an issue we got to take some action on? Or is it simply the annual report and we just kick back and let you do your thing?
It is the annual report. My understanding is that it's outside my role, but my understanding in talking to the commissioner and our policy experts is that we do not have any proposals on the table as it relates to anything that would impact the trust fund per se. There is a technical correction, and I'm not sure where that is in the process. And it is just we believe, a technical correction to how the term high benefit cost ratio is defined, because our current statute as written does not align with the federal government's, and they've flagged it for us saying, hey, this does not comport to ours. Therefore, you can't use our report. They produce a lot of comprehensive reports to compare states and how each state is doing. Our definition is out of line of theirs. So ours is not, we can't purely just pick up one of their reports and say this is directly comparable because there's a slight tweak in.
Yeah.
And I don't know where that, if it's, yeah. So that's to my knowledge, the only thing related to the trust fund that's on the table. And that is more just for ironing out a wrinkle that we believe exists as opposed to intended legislation.
Thank you.
Questions? Great, Matt, thank you. Appreciate your time.
Good stuff.
All the good information.
Yeah, and I made 2 notes of things that I can provide to the committee just for future reference. And should you want me to come back and talk about that, feel free to do so. But I'll send along the taxable wage basis, what we've had over time, and also this, I believe it's publicly available. It's an array report. It'll show where all the employers are scheduled out, and it even goes into something called negative balance employers. So,
Yeah, well, if we find time towards the end of the session where we're kind of not having anything to do, I think we'll bring you back in again.
sir.
And have those conversations about what are negative balance employers, seasonals, how does that affect the fund? Also talk about reimbursable employers. I think we talked a little bit about those as well and how that works on the fund. And yeah, so there's still a lot to talk about. And I always find it interesting. So with that, I think